Story number 1.
The sun was beginning to set as I walked along the narrow trail, the path that wound its way through the thick pines of the Cascade Mountains. I had hiked many trails in my life, and I thought I knew what to expect in the wilderness, but this one was different. There was something about the air that felt heavier here, more oppressive, and the closer I got to my campsite, the more the strange feeling crept up on me. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo adventure to get away from the chaos of city life. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I craved it. The solitude of hiking alone in the mountains had always been a balm for my soul, a time to clear my mind and find peace. I had meticulously planned the hike, checking maps, reading reviews of the trail, making sure to pack everything I needed for a couple of days in the wilderness. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing more than a weekend away, but something felt off from the moment I arrived at the trailhead. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just one other car parked near the entrance. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trail itself was quiet, too quiet. Usually when you're out in nature, you hear something. The calls of birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, or the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. But here, there was nothing, only the faint hum of my boots on the dirt trail and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. I shook off the feeling and continued on, hoping the sense of unease would fade as I settled into the hike. The forest grew denser as I made my way deeper into the mountains, and the fading light from the sun seemed to be swallowed by the trees. I reached the halfway point as the first stars began to appear in the sky, and I knew I should make camp soon. According to the map, there was a small little clearing just ahead that would be perfect for setting up my tent. When I arrived at the clearing, I was relieved to find it was untouched, just as the trail descriptions had promised. The trees surrounded the area, their towering trunks standing guard like ancient sentinels. I pitched my tent quickly and set up my stove to cook a simple meal. The quiet of the forest was unsettling, but I tried to focus on the task at hand. As I ate my dinner, the first real sounds of the forest began to emerge. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But there was something else too. Something I couldn't quite place. It was a low sound, almost like a hum coming from somewhere deep within the forest. I paused, listening, but it stopped as soon as I tried to focus on it. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize it away. But as the night grew darker, the sound returned, this time clearer, like a low drone vibrating through the earth. I glanced nervously around the clearing, but there was nothing visible. No animals, no movement, just the flickering of my campfire and the dark expanse of the woods beyond. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would put my nerves at ease. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, the sound of the outside world muffled as I lay down on my sleeping pad. But sleep didn't come easily. The hum, the drone, whatever it was, seemed to grow louder as the night went on. It was persistent, almost like it was surrounding me, vibrating through the ground beneath me. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the sound of my breathing and the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance nervously at the entrance of the tent. It felt as though something was watching me, something just beyond the veil of the trees. Suddenly, there was a knock. Soft, deliberate, 3 distinct raps on the side of the tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My first thought was that it was another hiker, someone lost or trying to find their way. But I quickly realized how unlikely that was. The nearest trail junction was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single soul since the parking lot. The knock came again, louder this time, and then another, this time from the opposite side of the tent. My heart raced, and I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I slowly reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light outside, but there was nothing. Just the inky blackness of the forest and the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. I stood still for a long time, listening for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves, just the faint hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. but the rest of the night was a restless blur. I woke up several times, each time hearing the hum and the occasional knock on the tent. Every time I checked, there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. Just the empty forest and the strange, persistent hum. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my camp quickly, eager to get moving and leave the strange events of the night behind me. But as I hiked further into the forest, the sense of unease didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. It felt as though the trees were closing in around me, and the air seemed thick with something I couldn't explain. I reached a fork in the trail a few miles later. According to the map, the left trail would take me to a nearby lake where I planned to camp for the night. The right trail was the one I had originally intended to follow, a route that would take me out of the forest and back to the trailhead. Something inside me told me to take the right trail, to get out of the forest as quickly as possible. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. It was as though the forest itself was beckoning me to stay, and that frightened me more than anything. I took the right trail, moving quickly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig made my heart race. And then, just as I was about to reach the edge of the forest, I heard it again, the low hum. This time it was louder, closer, vibrating through the air in a way that made my skin crawl. It was almost like the sound was coming from underneath the earth itself, as though something was calling to me from deep within the ground. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my feet pounding against the dirt trail. The hum followed me, growing louder and more insistent, and I knew without a doubt that whatever it was following me. Finally, I reached the trailhead. The parking lot was still empty, the sun high in the sky. I collapsed into my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, and I didn't stop until I was well beyond the reach of the forest. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. The hum, the knocking on my tent, the feeling of being watched. It was all too real to be a figment of my imagination. But the worst part is that I'm not the only one who's experienced it. I've heard stories from other hikers who ventured into those woods, stories of strange sounds, unexplained movements, and an overwhelming sense of dread. I haven't been back to those mountains since. I don't think I ever will. Whatever it was out there, it's better left alone. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The plan was simple. A 3-day hike through the backwoods of West Virginia. My friend Dave and I had been hiking together for years, and we wanted something off the beaten path. No tourists, no distractions, just wilderness. Dave had found an old unmarked trail on a forum supposedly used decades ago by loggers. The forest was dense, untouched. It felt like stepping back in time. The first day was perfect. We made good progress, set up camp near a small river, and spent the evening cooking over a fire. That night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard twigs snapping. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath, listening. "Dave?" I whispered. He mumbled in his sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still. I stayed awake for another hour, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I told Dave what I'd heard. He shrugged it off. "Probably a deer," he said. "Maybe a bear." We packed up and moved deeper into the forest. Around midday, we found something strange. An old, rusted chainsaw half buried in the dirt. Nearby, there was a pile of rotting wood, as if someone had started cutting logs but never finished. "Guess the logging story was true," I said. Dave nodded, but looked uneasy. "This stuff's been here a long time." We pushed on. The forest thickened, the trees growing closer together. By late afternoon, the trail had nearly disappeared. We stopped at a clearing to check our map. That's when we smelled it. Rot. Something dead. It was strong, so strong it made my stomach turn. We searched around, expecting to find an animal carcass. Instead, we found an old campsite. There was a tent, partially collapsed, covered in dirt and leaves. A backpack lay open, its contents scattered. Clothes, a flashlight, a notebook. Everything was faded, weathered. "How long do you think this has been here?" I asked. Dave knelt and picked up the notebook. The pages were damp, smeared with dirt, but some writing was still visible. He read out loud, "Don't go past the clearing. They don't like it when you go past the clearing." We exchanged a look. "Who's they?" I muttered. Dave flipped through more pages, but most of the writing was illegible. Just scratches, half-finished sentences. "The trees aren't right. I keep hearing something at night. No way out. I walked in circles for hours. I'm not alone out here." Then the last entry. "They are watching. I hear them tapping on the trees at night. I hear them whispering. I should have never come here." A chill crawled up my spine. "We should head back," I said. Dave hesitated but nodded. We turned around, retracing our steps, but something was wrong. The trail was gone. I mean, completely gone. We should have been able to follow our own footprints in the soft earth, but there was nothing. Just untouched forest. Panic crept in. "We just came from this way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dave pulled out the compass. "We head west. We'll hit the river again." We walked and walked. The sun was setting, and we still hadn't found the river. The trees seemed to shift around us, pressing closer. Every so often, I'd hear a faint tap, tap, tap somewhere in the distance. Then we found the second tent. Just like the first, old, abandoned. But this one was worse. The fabric was shredded, claw marks ripped through the sides. Inside, more scattered belongings, a cooking pot, a boot, and a knife stuck into the dirt. No notebook this time, just a single word carved into the side of a tree. "Run." My chest tightened. "We camp here," Dave said firmly. "It'll be dark soon." I wanted to argue, but we had no choice. We built a fire, sitting close. The forest around us felt suffocating. And then, just past the light of the fire, I saw it. A shape, not an animal, not a person. Something standing between the trees, tall, still, watching. I opened my mouth to speak, but then it was gone. I turned to Dave, but from the look on his face, I knew he'd seen it too. Neither of us slept. All night, we heard tapping. Soft, rhythm moving around us. In the morning, we didn't speak. We just packed up and walked. Hours passed. Then we saw smoke. A campfire. Relief flooded through me. "Someone's out here," I called. We ran toward it, pushing through the brush, then stopped. It was our fire, our campsite, the same shredded tent, the same boot, the same knife in the ground. We had walked in a circle. Dave's breathing turned shallow. No, this isn't right." We didn't stop. We kept moving. I don't know how long we walked. The sun barely moved in the sky. The forest never changed. Then Dave screamed. I turned. Something was behind him. A figure, tall, thin, its limbs too long, its face was just a blank stretch of pale skin. And then it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. We ran. Branches whipped against my arms, my legs. I didn't care. I just kept running. Then, sunlight. The road. We burst from the trees like drowning men breaking the surface. My knees hit the ground. I gasped for air. We had made it. I turned to look back. The trees stood still. Swatching. We never spoke about what happened, never told anyone, but sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I hear it. The tapping, waiting. Story. The end.
Story number 3.
I had always loved the outdoors. Hiking was my way of escaping the noise of everyday life, reconnecting with myself, and appreciating the beauty of nature. I had explored plenty of trails, both near and far, but nothing had quite the appeal of the high mountain ranges in the Pacific Northwest. For years, I had heard friends talk about the Olympic National Park and its trails, particularly the Enchanted Valley. They described it as one of the most beautiful places you could visit, where the forests were so lush they looked like something out of a fairy tale. The idea of hiking through that magical valley had always been in the back of my mind, but I finally decided to make it a reality in the spring of 2019. I had the time off work and was ready for an adventure. I would go solo, something I'd done many times before, and take a few days to explore the Enchanted Valley. The forecast was favorable, the trail was well marked, and I had all the gear I needed for a multi-day hike. I arrived at the park on a sunny morning, excited for the trek ahead. After stopping at the visitor center to grab maps and check in with a ranger about any trail updates, I headed toward the Enchanted Valley trailhead. The day was warm, but not too hot, and the first few miles were relatively easy as well, taking me through dense forest and along the Quinault River. The sound of the river rushing beside me was soothing, a constant companion as I hiked deeper into the woods. By the time I reached my first camp, I had covered about 10 miles. The area was peaceful, with only a few other hikers around. I set up my tent near the riverbank, cooked a quick dinner, and spent the evening relaxing by the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me began to feel even quieter. There were no sounds of wildlife, no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't unsettling at first. It was just the kind of quiet you experience in the deep woods, calm, peaceful, natural. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It wasn't the usual noises I was used to hearing in the wilderness. It was a low, rhythmic thud, like something heavy was moving through the underbrush nearby. I lay there, listening, wondering if it was a bear or elk, though I knew bears were not common in this area. Still, the noise persisted, moving closer and closer to my campsite. It was too deliberate to be an animal, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little, shining the beam into the dark. The beam caught the edge of a tree, a patch of moss, and nothing more. But the thudding sound kept going. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if there were more than one source. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind or maybe a tree falling. Nature has a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially in the dark. I tried to fall back asleep, but the sound lingered in my mind, like a faint echo that wouldn't leave. The next morning, I decided to push on and continue toward the Enchanted Valley. I packed up quickly, eager to move on from the strange noise of the night before. The trail was much more remote now, and the deeper I went into the valley, the more I felt the isolation of the place. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer, and the air heavier. But it was beautiful. Towering old-growth trees stretched toward the sky, and the river continued its wild rush beside me. I stopped for a break after a few hours of hiking, finding a spot to sit on a large boulder next to the river. I had my water bottle in hand and was taking in the surrounding beauty when I noticed something strange. Just across the river, not far from where I was sitting, there was a small trail leading off into the trees. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used. There were no signs of any camps or recent footprints, but the trail seemed to veer off into the woods in a way that didn't sit right with me. It was as if someone had deliberately avoided the main trail, taking a shortcut through the thick forest. The thought crossed my mind to investigate, but something held me back. The forest was still, too still. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of small animals, no breeze, just silence. I stared at the trail for what felt like too long, before finally shaking off the unease and continuing my journey forward. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. I had stopped thinking about the strange trail across the river, but the sense of isolation in the valley weighed heavily on me. It wasn't that I was afraid, I was just uncomfortable. Still, I pressed on, determined to reach the valley by the end of the day. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The Enchanted Valley was everything I had hoped for, majestic, serene, and untouched by modern life. The towering trees were so densely packed together that they formed almost a canopy over the valley floor. A river wound through the center of the valley, and the snow-capped peaks rose high above. It was a sight to behold, and for a moment all the unsettling thoughts melted away as I marveled at the view. I set up camp, making sure my tent was securely placed and my food stored away properly. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and I could feel the chill creeping into the valley. It was peaceful, though. I had the place to myself, and I decided to take a walk along the river before nightfall. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something moving in the trees across the river. But as I stepped closer to the edge of the water, I could see a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the trees. I froze, squinting to get a better look. The figure was tall, cloaked in dark clothing, and completely still. For a moment, I wondered if it was another hiker, someone who had made their way off the trail like I had seen earlier in the day. But something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It stood motionless, staring across the river, as if it had been there for hours. No backpack, no gear, nothing but the silhouette against the darkening trees. I called out, "Hey, are you okay? Are you lost?" The figure didn't move. My heart began to pound. I took a step forward, but the figure immediately turned and walked off into the trees, vanishing quickly into the thick underbrush without a sound. It was so abrupt, so unnatural that I felt a chill grip my spine. I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Was I imagining things? The figure had disappeared too quickly, and I was too far away to make out any details, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I quickly turned around and returned to my camp, my mind racing. As I entered the tent, I double-checked everything. My food was secured, the gear packed properly, and the fire was still going. The last thing I wanted to do was go outside and investigate, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Who had been out there? And why had they been so silent? The night passed uneventfully, though I didn't sleep much. The quiet of the valley was oppressive, and I kept hearing the sound of footsteps just beyond the perimeter of my camp. They were faint, but unmistakable. Every time I thought I was imagining it, the sound would start again, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking around my camp. At first light, I packed up and decided to head out. I didn't even bother to eat or drink. I just wanted to get off the mountain. The hike back to the trailhead felt like it took forever. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, or hear those slow, deliberate footsteps in the distance. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I was relieved to find the parking lot empty, and I didn't stop to look back as I drove away. To this day, I can't explain what happened in the Enchanted Valley. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something else out there in those woods, something that wasn't human? I don't know. But I've never returned to the Olympic National Park, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left unexplored, and some feelings are best left unspoken. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I wasn't supposed to be out there alone. The plan was for my brother Jake and I to hike the old fire road through the Pisgah National Forest. We'd done the route before, but this time he bailed at the last minute for a work emergency. I should have rescheduled, but I was stubborn. The weather was perfect, and I told myself it would be good to clear my head. I left early that morning, parking my truck near the trailhead. The first few miles were peaceful, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the rustling of the trees. The fire road was overgrown in places, but I'd done this hike enough to know the way. By midday, I stopped for a break near a small clearing. That's when I noticed something strange, an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. The words were so faded I could barely read them, but when I got closer, I made it out. Stay on the trail. Do not enter the woods. It seemed odd. This wasn't a maintained trail, just an old fire road that had fallen out of use. But warnings like that usually meant unstable ground or dangerous wildlife. I took a picture of the sign with my phone, then kept moving. Around mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen another person all day. It wasn't unusual. This wasn't a popular hike, but something about it felt off. The woods were too quiet, no birds, no squirrels, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it, a single sharp whistle. I froze. It had come from somewhere off in the trees, maybe 50 yards away. Another whistle, this time closer. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing, just dense forest. It wasn't a bird. It was too deliberate, too human. I didn't call out. Some instinct told me not to. Instead, I picked up my pace, heading toward my planned campsite a few miles ahead. The whistling followed me. Not constantly, just every so often a single, sharp note. Always from a different direction, like someone moving parallel to me, hidden in the trees. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was setting. I hurried to set up my tent, my hands shaking as I struck a match for the fire. The flames made me feel safer, but only just. As darkness fell, the forest felt different, heavier, like the trees were pressing in closer. I ate without really tasting my food, my ears straining for any sound over the crackling fire. For a while, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the woods at night. Then, a snap of a branch. I whipped my head around. Just beyond the tree line, something moved. Not an animal, something taller, a shape barely visible in the flickering firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay by the fire, refusing to retreat into my tent. If something was out there, I wanted to see it coming. Hours passed. The fire burned low. My eyelids grew heavy. Then, a whisper. A voice. So quiet I almost thought I imagined it. But I heard it. My name, spoken softly from the dark. I shot up, heart hammering. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I swept it across the trees. No one. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back to my tent, gripping my knife, staring into the dark until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was bright enough, I packed my gear and started back the way I came. My body ached with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I was about 5 miles from my truck when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My footprints. They were fresh, heading the wrong way. Someone had walked my path during the night, following me. I moved faster, practically jogging down the trail. The feeling of being watched never left me. The trees felt wrong, too silent, too still. Then, just as I came around a bend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man stood in the middle of the trail. He was maybe 50 feet away, wearing old, dirty clothes, his skin pale as death, and he was smiling. Not a friendly smile. A grin too wide, too forced, like he was waiting for me. I stopped dead, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Morning," he said. His voice was light, casual, like we were just two hikers passing each other. I didn't answer. "You lost?" he asked, tilting his head. I shook my head slowly. "No, just heading back." His grin widened. "Good. Wouldn't want to get stuck out here." I took a step back. He didn't move. Then, without another word, I turned and ran. I sprinted down the trail, not caring if I tripped, not caring if I made noise. I just ran. Behind me, I heard laughter. Not normal laughter. A whistle mixed with a laugh, high-pitched and unnatural. I didn't stop. I ran until I saw my truck, practically throwing myself inside and locking the doors. Only then did I dare to look back. The trail was empty. The forest was silent. I peeled out of there, not stopping until I hit the highway. I never reported it. What would I even say? I don't hike alone anymore, and sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I still hear the whistling. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I had always been an avid hiker. As long as I could remember, my weekends had been dedicated to exploring new trails, finding hidden gems in the wilderness, and experiencing the thrill of being alone in nature. But there was one trip, one hike, that changed everything. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget it. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to hike the Olympic National Park in Washington State. The park had always intrigued me, with its dense, moss-covered forests, alpine lakes, and dramatic coastlines. The Hoh rainforest in particular caught my attention. Known for its lush green environment and ancient trees, it was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of life. I planned the trip meticulously. I took a few days off work, packed up my gear, and set off alone, eager to see the forest's beauty and immerse myself in its serene atmosphere. I had hiked solo before, so the idea of being alone didn't scare me. If anything, it made the experience more personal and fulfilling. The drive to the trailhead was long, but the scenic views of the forested mountains and the Pacific Ocean made it worth it. When I arrived at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, the parking lot was nearly empty, which I found odd considering the beauty of the place. I figured most people had already started their hikes for the day, so I grabbed my pack, made sure I had enough water and snacks, and started the trail by myself. The Hoh River Trail was a long and steady route, about 17 miles out and back, leading me into the heart of the rainforest. I had planned to camp near the river, enjoy a quiet night under the stars, and head back the next morning. The trail was mostly flat, but as I made my way deeper into the forest, the trees began to grow more dense, their branches thick with green moss. The air was cool and damp, and the constant, soothing sound of the river beside me provided a calming background to my hike. As the hours passed, the trail became quieter and more isolated. I didn't see a single person on my way in. I kept my eyes peeled for wildlife, elk, deer, or maybe a bear, but all I saw were birds and the occasional squirrel darting up trees. There was something almost otherworldly about the quietude, like the forest was holding its breath. It was peaceful, yet unsettling in its solitude. Around mid-afternoon, I came to a small clearing beside the river. The water was calm here, a perfect spot to set up camp. I decided to stop for the day and rest. The temperature was beginning to drop, and I figured it would be best to settle in before the darkness of night completely took over. I set up my tent near the river, collected some firewood, and started a small fire to ward off the chill. As I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and listening to the crackling wood, a strange thought crossed my mind. I hadn't seen anyone since the visitor center, and there was no sign of any other hikers on the trail. It wasn't unusual to be alone in the backcountry, but the silence felt off, like I was the only living person for miles. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I looked around, half expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. But the forest remained still, the trees towering over me like silent watchers. Nightfall came quickly, and with it, a deepening silence. The fire flickered and popped, its light casting long shadows around the campsite. I finished my dinner and crawled into my tent, the heavy scent of wet earth and pine needles surrounding me. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the trees, but there was no other sound, no creatures stirring, no calls of owls or coyotes. The only noise was the constant rush of the river. I lay there in the dark, trying to sleep, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation, it was deeper than that. Every time the wind blew through the trees, I felt a chill down my spine, like there was someone else out there. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, the feeling lingered. Around midnight, I woke with a start. Something had disturbed the stillness of the night, an unmistakable noise. It was faint at first, but as I listened, it became clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and uneven, like someone was walking around my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in my tent, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a rustling sound, as if something large was moving through the underbrush near the river. I froze, my mind racing. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but my hands were shaking too much to get a steady beam. I unzipped the tent just a little, trying to peer out into the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, no figures, just the deep shadows of the trees and the dim glow of my fire. I must have imagined it, I thought. It was just the wind, or maybe an animal, I reasoned. But my instincts told me something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again, and I could feel my pulse quickening. The footsteps resumed, this time closer, much closer. I could hear them crunching on the forest floor, and I immediately knew that whatever was out there was not an animal. The movements were too deliberate, too purposeful. I couldn't see who or what was approaching, but I could feel its presence, and it was chilling. I waited in silence, hoping whatever it was would leave. But the footsteps grew louder, circling around my camp. I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing, ragged and shallow, but there was no one to be seen. Panic started to rise in my chest. I had read about strange occurrences in the wilderness before, things that couldn't be explained, like hikers hearing footsteps but never seeing anyone, but I never thought I would experience it myself. I grabbed my knife from my pack, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I needed to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was not leaving. I listened intently, but the footsteps suddenly stopped, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. I waited, holding my breath, but the silence felt suffocating. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath with me. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there in the darkness, hoping to hear something, anything, to reassure me. But the longer I waited, the more I realized I couldn't just sit there. I had to get out of there. I carefully packed up my gear, my hands still trembling, and tried to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Every rustle, every snap of a twig had me on edge. I quickly packed up my tent and gear, my heart racing, and started to hike back down the trail, away from the river, away from the campsite. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But no one was there. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was quiet once again. But I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hiding something dark and unsettling. I hiked through the night, not stopping once, my mind consumed with the fear that whatever had been circling my camp was still out there, watching me from the shadows. By the time I reached the trailhead at dawn, I was exhausted, drenched in sweat, and my nerves were shot. But when I reached my car, I was relieved to find it empty, no sign of anyone else. I drove away from the park, never once looking back. I never did find out who or what had been walking around my campsite that night, but the fear of it still lingers, and I haven't returned to the Hoh rainforest since. Every time I think about it, I wonder if I was just imagining things, if it was simply the isolation playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I heard, and I know I'll never forget the sensation of being watched by something in that dark, silent forest. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had been hiking for years, but it wasn't until one of my solo trips in the fall of 2018 that I encountered something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I was in the Pacific Northwest, a region known for its dense forests, towering peaks, and the quiet solitude it offers to hikers. It was a part of the world that I had always wanted to explore more deeply. I had planned this solo hiking trip to the Olympic National Park. The idea was to hike the Enchanted Valley Trail and spend a few nights in the woods by the Quinault River. The timing was perfect. The fall weather was crisp but not too cold, and the fall colors were in full bloom. I arrived at the park late in the morning, hoping to get a good head start. The trailhead wasn't crowded, which was great. I preferred hiking alone, as it gave me the time to reflect and be immersed in the wilderness without the distraction of other people. The first couple of miles were relatively easy, following the Quinault River as it rushed alongside the trail. The trees were so tall, their trunks wrapped in thick moss, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. It felt like I had stepped into another world, a quiet world where the hustle and bustle of modern life didn't exist. After a couple of hours, I found a spot to take a break by the river. It was serene. I let the sound of the water soothe my mind and watched the occasional bird darting above. The place was peaceful, far removed from anything remotely urban. It was the kind of isolation I had been craving. I kept moving for several more hours, the trail winding deeper into the heart of the forest. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip, and the forest took on a darker, more mysterious feel. The trees were so thick now that they blocked out a lot of the light, and the ground was damp from the morning's dew. I had planned to camp about 5 miles into the valley, near a spot by the river that I had read about in a trail guide. It would be a perfect spot to set up my tent, cook some food, and watch the stars come out as night settled in. I reached the campsite by late afternoon, and just as I had hoped, it was beautiful, isolated, surrounded by trees, and right next to the river. The campsite was small, but perfect for a solo hiker like me. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent, and began to prepare my dinner. As I cooked, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it was. Normally there's some wildlife in the area, especially in the late afternoon when the animals are active. But here, there was nothing. No rustling in the bushes, no birds calling, no insects buzzing. It felt almost unnatural. I shook it off, thinking maybe it was just the time of day. Perhaps the animals had gone into the deeper woods for the evening. I ate my dinner by the fire, watching the flames dance and feeling the warmth spread through my body. But as the light from the fire started to fade and the shadows deepened, an unsettling feeling crept in. There was something about the quiet of the forest that didn't sit right. The kind of quiet where you start to feel like you're not really alone, like something is watching you, just out of sight. I finished my meal and cleaned up, then sat by the fire for a little while longer, staring into the flames. I wasn't tired yet, but the stillness of the place was starting to wear on me. It was so thick, so oppressive. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I had been hiking for hours and was probably just overtired. Around dusk, I decided to go for a short walk to stretch my legs before heading to bed. The air had cooled significantly, and a fog was starting to roll in, making everything look surreal. I took the trail that led along the riverbank, the ground soft and spongy beneath my boots. The fog was thick enough that I could only see a few feet in front of me, but it was strangely beautiful, almost dreamlike. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. But then something strange happened. I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then the footsteps came again, slow, deliberate, and not from any direction I could place. It wasn't the sound of animals or even the rustle of the leaves or branches. It was a clear, unmistakable sound of someone walking in the woods. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The footsteps continued, and they were getting closer. I stood completely still, holding my breath, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. The footsteps were coming from the other side of the river, but I couldn't see anyone. No one was walking on the trail, and there was no way anyone could have crossed the river without me hearing it. Yet the footsteps continued, moving closer and closer, and I could swear I heard something else. Something that sounded like whispering, but just faint enough that I couldn't make out the words. I felt a wave of coldness wash over me, a deep, visceral chill that crept into my bones. This wasn't right. My instincts told me to turn around, to head back to the safety of my camp and my tent, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like if I moved, I would provoke something I didn't want to provoke. I took a few cautious steps back toward the campsite, the footsteps now matching my pace. It was as though whoever or whatever was out there was following me. I quickened my pace, my heart racing, but the footsteps kept up, always just behind me. My mind raced through all the possible explanations. Other hikers, someone lost, maybe a ranger checking on the area, but none of them felt right. I was in an isolated part of the park, far away from any main trails, and I hadn't passed anyone all day. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the outline of my campsite through the trees, and the river's constant rush seemed to grow louder, drowning out everything else. Just as I reached the edge of my campsite, I heard a voice, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It wasn't coming from the trail, though. It came from the direction of the river, the very spot where I had set up camp. I froze. "Help me," the voice said, barely more than a breath. It was a voice of a man, but it was ragged, almost strained, as if it had been calling out for a long time. I turned quickly, trying to catch sight of whoever was speaking, but the fog was too thick. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't even hear the footsteps anymore. I ran back to my tent and bolted the zipper shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat there in the dark, barely daring to breathe. The fire had gone out, and I was completely alone in the dark woods. The silence returned, but it was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that feels suffocating. I lay there in my sleeping bag for hours, eyes wide open, listening for any sounds of movement outside. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, or that whispering voice, but there was nothing. The hours dragged on, and the fear wouldn't let me sleep. Finally, just before dawn, I decided I couldn't stay another minute. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, barely checking to make sure everything was in order. I grabbed my gear and made my way back down the trail, hardly stopping to rest. The fog still hung in the trees, but the air felt different now. It was as if I was walking through a world that didn't quite belong to me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. Like something was still out there, following me. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had started to rise, casting a weak light over the valley. I didn't look back at the forest as I drove away, but the memories of that night, the footsteps, the whispering, the feeling of being hunted, stayed with me, haunting me even now. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that forest. I don't know if it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me, or if there was something that didn't belong in the woods. But I've never gone back to the Enchanted Valley, and I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I've been hiking for years through countless trails and wilderness areas across the country. I've spent nights under the stars, slept by rivers, and explored dense forests with nothing but a backpack, a tent, and a flashlight. There's something about being completely alone in nature that has always calmed me. The quiet of the wilderness, the solitude, it was always where I felt most at peace. But that all changed one late summer evening in the Adirondack Mountains. I had planned the trip for weeks, a solo hike up to the summit of Mount Marcy, the highest peak in New York. I had done research, checked the weather, and packed everything I would need for a couple of days in the mountains. I was excited to escape the busyness of life and immerse myself in the quiet beauty of the Adirondacks. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning. The parking lot wasn't crowded, just a few cars scattered around, which suited me perfectly. I didn't want to share the trail with a lot of people. The weather was ideal, sunny with a slight breeze. The trail was well marked, and I knew the hike would take me around 6 hours to the summit if I kept a steady pace. I started out quickly, eager to reach the top and set up camp before nightfall. The trail started out as a gradual climb, winding through a dense forest of hardwoods. I could hear the sounds of nature all around me. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional bird call, the crunch of pine needles underfoot. The day was warm, but the trees kept most of the sun at bay, casting long shadows along the trail. I was in my element, moving steadily upward with only the sounds of my boots crunching on the dirt and the soft hum of the breeze in the treetops. A couple of hours in, I passed a group of hikers coming down from the summit. They were friendly, waved as they passed, and warned me that it might be a little cold at the top, but the weather should hold. I thanked them and kept moving. As the trail got steeper, the trees began to thin out, and I started to see more open rock faces and exposed roots, signs that I was getting closer to the summit. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the base of the mountain and began the final stretch. The climb to the summit was more challenging. It required scrambling over large boulders and pulling myself up steep rock faces, but I was in good shape and didn't mind the effort. The views were incredible. I stopped every now and then to catch my breath and take in the expansive vistas of the surrounding mountain ranges and lakes below. The air was thin, and the higher I climbed, the quieter it became. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustling in the trees, just an eerie, peaceful stillness that hung in the air. By the time I reached the summit, it was nearing sunset. The view from the top was breathtaking, a panoramic sweep of forested mountains stretching into the distance. I took a few moments to appreciate the beauty, snapping a couple of pictures before I started setting up camp. I found a flat spot near the edge of the summit, away from the main trail, and pitched my tent. As I began to settle in, I noticed how quickly the temperature was dropping. It wasn't unusual for mountain weather to change rapidly, especially as the sun began to set. I bundled up in my jacket and started a small campfire to ward off the chill. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest around me felt unusually quiet, almost unnervingly so. No birds, no insects, just the occasional gust of wind sweeping across the rocks. I tried to push the feeling aside. It had been a long day of hiking, and I was tired. I had just finished cooking a simple meal when I heard something. Footsteps, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone making their way up the final stretch to the summit. But the footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. It sounded like someone was moving carefully, quietly, as if they were trying to avoid being noticed. I stood up, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I scanned the darkening forest, but there was no sign of anyone. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. I hesitated, thinking it might have been my imagination, but the sound of the footsteps continued, drawing closer, though still out of sight. I quickly doused the campfire, not wanting to give away my position. The last thing I needed was some lost hiker stumbling into my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the sound, but as I shone the light into the trees, I saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I was on edge now. My instincts told me to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Something wasn't right. I took a deep breath and gathered myself, deciding I should wait for a few minutes before making any hasty decisions. The forest was dark, and my camp was isolated. I had no way of knowing if the person was just lost or if something else was going on. After a few minutes, I started to feel foolish. Maybe it had just been the wind or a small animal. I was just about to turn around and head back to my tent when I heard something different, a voice, low and barely audible, coming from the trees. It wasn't a cry for help or a shout, but a soft, raspy whisper, like someone was calling my name. I froze. My blood ran cold. No one else was supposed to be up here. I was alone on this mountain, or at least I thought I was. I took a cautious step backward, listening for any further sounds. The whispering stopped, but now I could hear something else, a faint rustling, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my backpack and reached for my emergency whistle, my heart racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I considered packing up and heading down the mountain, but the last thing I wanted to do was venture into the dark forest alone. It was too dangerous, and the trail down would take hours. The rustling continued, and the whispers started again, this time clearer, though still unintelligible. It was like a voice carried on the wind, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out what it was saying. I decided I had to investigate. I turned on my flashlight and moved toward the sound, slowly, my pulse thumping in my ears. The light from my flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness of the woods. I moved cautiously, staying close to the trail, but as I walked, I realized the sounds had stopped. The rustling, the whispers, all of it had gone silent. I called out again, louder this time. "Is someone out there?" No response. I took a few more steps, my anxiety growing with every crunch of the leaves underfoot. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just inside the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, with broad shoulders and a dark, hooded silhouette. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence as if it were watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable, a person. Or something looked like one, standing completely still, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I stumbled back in shock, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, though I knew the answer already. There was no response. Suddenly, the figure stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees with a fluidity that was unnatural. The rustling resumed, but this time it was distant, fading into the forest. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited for a moment, expecting the figure to return, but it didn't. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that presses in on you and makes you feel like you're no longer alone. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and ran back to my camp. My hands were shaking as I packed my belongings, not bothering to fold anything neatly, just throwing it into my pack. I was disoriented, too afraid to stay in the same spot any longer. I didn't stop to light another fire. I didn't even bother to check the trail map. I just started heading down the mountain. It took me hours to make it back to the trailhead, the trail seeming longer and more treacherous in the dark. I was exhausted, but the fear kept me moving. When I finally made it back to the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car still there, untouched. I didn't look back at the mountain as I drove away. I couldn't. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or what I heard. The whispers, the figure, none of it makes sense. And I've never returned to Mount Marcy. I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I was 18. The summer, I took a solo hiking trip through the Adirondacks. It was meant to be a personal challenge, a test before heading off to college. I had grown up camping and hiking with my dad, so I wasn't inexperienced. I planned a 3-day trek through a remote part of the forest, a route I had mapped out myself. The first day was uneventful. I started early, following an old logging trail before cutting into the thicker woods. The sun was bright, the birds were loud, and everything felt peaceful. By late afternoon, I found a good clearing to set up camp. I built a fire, cooked a small meal, and settled in to watch the sunset. Then, as the light faded, I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. The birds had stopped singing, the wind had died, even the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush had vanished. It was just silent, a deep, unnatural silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling. Then, sometime in the night, a sound woke me up. A soft, deliberate tapping against my tent. I froze. It was slow, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch. It was someone. I held my breath, listening. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal, a lost hiker, a prank. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, I whispered, "Hello?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, crunch. Footsteps. Just outside my tent. I forced myself to sit up, heart pounding in my throat. "Who's there?" I called, louder this time. No answer. I reached for my flashlight and in one motion unzipped the tent and shined the beam outside. Nothing. The forest stretched out, still and empty. My fire had burned down to embers. The trees stood tall and unmoving, but I knew someone had been there. I sat awake for hours, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I had convinced myself I must have imagined it, some trick of the wind, some half-dream in my sleep. But then I saw the footprints. They circled my tent. Not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet. I packed my gear in record time and started moving. I didn't run, I didn't want to look panicked, but I walked fast, sticking to the trail. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, about an hour into my hike, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small wooden figure. It was carved crudely, but I could tell what it was supposed to be: a person. And the worst part, it was hanging from a tree, by a noose. I stared at it, cold sweat breaking across my back. Who had put it there, and when? I hadn't seen it the day before. I kept moving, faster. By noon, I had reached the halfway point of my route. I could either turn back the way I came, a full day's hike, or push forward, which would take me to a road in about 6 hours. I chose the road. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every few minutes, I would hear something, a rustle, a snap of a branch, but when I turned, nothing was there. Then, as I crested a ridge, I saw something ahead that made me stop cold. A man. Standing in the middle of the trail, he was far away, maybe 100 yards, but I could see him clearly. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I stepped back. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then he took a step forward. I turned and ran. I don't remember how long I ran. My pack slammed against my back. Branches whipped my arms, but I didn't stop. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. At some point, I tripped. My knee hit a rock, pain flaring up my leg. I gasped, rolling onto my back, and looked up. There, high in the trees, hanging from the branches, were dozens of those wooden figures, swinging slightly in the breeze. I scrambled to my feet and kept running. By some miracle, I made it to the road. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station where I collapsed outside, gasping for breath. A man came out, a worker, maybe in his 60s, and asked if I was okay. I told him I had been hiking, that I thought someone had been following me. His face went pale. "Where?" he asked. I told him my route. He shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone out there alone," he muttered. I pressed him for details, but he wouldn't say anything more. I never went back. I never told my dad. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that man, standing on the trail, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It started as a simple weekend hike. My friend Eric and I had planned it for weeks. A 2-day trip deep into the Rocky Mountains, a remote trail that promised solitude and breathtaking views. The first day was perfect. We made good progress, covered over 10 miles, and set up camp by a quiet lake. The night was calm, the stars stretched endlessly above us. It was the kind of moment that reminded me why I love the outdoors. But everything changed on the second day. We started early, packing up and following the trail deeper into the wilderness. Around noon, we found something strange, a second trail, barely visible, leading off into the trees. There was an old wooden signpost, but whatever had been written on it was long gone, worn away by time. Eric, always the curious one, wanted to follow it. "Just for a little bit," he said. "See where it goes." I hesitated. It wasn't on our map, and there was something about the way it twisted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows, that made my stomach tighten. But I didn't want to be the paranoid one. So we went. At first, it wasn't bad. The trees were thicker here, the air cooler. But as we walked, the atmosphere changed. The forest felt wrong. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our boots on the dirt. Then we saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, old and rotting, half swallowed by the forest. The roof had caved in on one side, and the windows were nothing but dark, empty holes. "This is awesome," Eric grinned, stepping forward. I grabbed his arm. "Dude, no. Come on, just a quick look." I wanted to turn back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But Eric was already moving, pushing open the half-broken door. I followed. The inside was worse. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Dust coated everything. There was a single wooden table in the center of the room, covered in deep scratches. Animal bones were piled in one corner. Then Eric pointed to the far wall. "What the hell is that?" I turned, and my blood went cold. Dozens of symbols had been carved into the wood, deep and jagged. They weren't words, not in any language I recognized, just strange, twisting shapes. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Some of the carvings were fresher than others. Someone had been here recently. A sound behind us. A single deliberate knock. We spun around. The door was open. The clearing outside was empty. But we weren't alone. A shadow moved just beyond the tree line, shifting between the trunks. Tall. Still. Watching. Eric grabbed my wrist. "Let's go." We bolted. We didn't stop until we were back on the main trail, gasping for breath. I turned, half expecting to see that figure standing at the forest's edge. Nothing. We didn't talk about it. Didn't mention the cabin, not the carvings, the shadow. We just kept walking, faster than before. Then we saw the footprints, leading toward us on the trail. Bare feet, large, deep, and fresh. Eric swore under his breath, "We need to move." The last 5 miles to the car were the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump. The trees felt like they were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. We threw our packs inside and peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind us. I didn't look back. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't want to know. But I dream about it sometimes. That shadow in the trees. Standing. Waiting. Story the end.